Lost your children's respect? Here's how to get it back. Have you ever felt like your own children no longer listen to you? That no matter how much you've sacrificed, your words no longer hold the same weight? Here's a surprising truth: most parents unknowingly teach their children to take them for granted. Not because they are bad children, but because we often give endlessly, without realizing that respect is something we must first demand from ourselves. In today's video, we'll explore 6 powerful Zen-based principles to regain your children's respect, not through conflict, but through wisdom. You'll learn how to set boundaries, embrace self-worth, and create a dynamic where respect flows naturally. Stay until the end, because I'll share one surprising Zen secret that will shift the way you see respect forever. Let's begin. 1. Stop chasing their approval, embrace your own self-worth. There is a quiet tragedy in the heart of many parents: the endless pursuit of their children's approval. You sacrifice, you accommodate, you bend until you nearly break, hoping they will look at you with admiration. But instead of gratitude, you are met with indifference. Instead of respect, you are taken for granted. Why? Because respect is never earned through self-erasure. This is a lesson echoed throughout history. Emperor Marcus Aurelius, one of the wisest rulers of Rome, never sought the approval of his people or his own son, Commodus. He ruled with integrity, guided by Stoic philosophy, knowing that true respect is not gained through flattery or indulgence but through unshakable character. He lived by his values, and through that, he commanded reverence, not by chasing it, but by embodying it. Contrast this with Emperor Wanli of the Ming dynasty, who, in his later years, became desperate to win favor with his court and his family. He gave in to their demands, hoping to be seen as benevolent, but instead, he became powerless in their eyes. The more he yielded, the more they took him for granted. His generosity became an expectation, not an act of kindness. And in the end, he lost both their respect and his own dignity. This is the paradox of human nature: we do not respect what is easily given. We admire what stands firm, what holds its ground. A Zen story illustrates this beautifully. A wise master once walked with his disciple through a bustling marketplace. They saw a merchant, desperate to sell his wares, lowering his prices again and again, calling out to every passerby. People glanced at him but kept walking. Then, they passed another stall, this one silent. The merchant sat quietly, unmoved, his goods arranged neatly. His prices were firm. And yet, people gathered around, eager to buy. The disciple asked, "Master, why do people ignore the one who pleads and rush to the one who does not?" The master smiled. Because the desperate man has already declared his worth, cheap and negotiable. The silent man, however, stands in his own value, and others recognize it. Parents who constantly chase their children's approval are like the desperate merchant. They lower their own worth with every unnecessary sacrifice, every swallowed word, every avoided conflict. But here is the truth: love does not mean endless accommodation. Respect is not won through self-denial. Buddhism teaches that attachment to external validation leads to suffering. The Dhammapada states, "He who seeks recognition is like a man grasping at the wind." The wise man does not beg for love, he simply loves, and in that love, he is free. The river that bends too much loses its power. The tree that sways to every wind uproots itself. Likewise, the parent who gives endlessly without boundaries loses the very authority that once held their child's respect. So, what should you do? Reclaim your dignity. Set boundaries, not as a punishment, but as an act of self-respect. Speak your truth, not with anger, but with quiet certainty. Be the unwavering mountain, not the shifting sand. Your children will not always like it. They may resist, complain, even withdraw. But in time, they will see what you have always deserved, not just love, but respect, and that, in the end, is far more valuable than fleeting approval. 2. Don't argue, lead by example. The loudest voice in the room is often the weakest. Those who argue, who desperately try to prove their point, often reveal not strength, but insecurity. History is filled with leaders who understood this truth. Take George Washington, the first president of the United States. He rarely engaged in heated debates or public arguments. Instead, he led with quiet dignity. During the Constitutional Convention, when disagreements raged, Washington did not waste energy arguing. He simply carried himself with such integrity, such unwavering presence, that others naturally followed. He did not force respect. He embodied it. Contrast this with Napoleon Bonaparte, a brilliant strategist, but also a man who demanded loyalty through intimidation and argument. He constantly sought to prove himself, engaging in endless conflicts, both on and off the battlefield. And yet, his empire crumbled, his power slipped through his fingers, and he died in exile, because fear and force can never sustain true respect. This principle is deeply embedded in Zen philosophy. The student once asked his master, "How do I make others see the truth?" The master simply smiled and began sweeping the courtyard. The student, confused, asked again, "Master, what is the answer?" The master continued sweeping. Finally, the student fell silent and simply watched. And in that stillness, he understood. Truth is not shouted. It is lived. This is the key to influencing others, especially your own children. A man named Robert once struggled with his grown children dismissing his opinions. They challenged everything he said, undermining his authority at every turn. He used to argue, trying to make them see reason, but the more he fought, the more they resisted. One day, he made a decision. He would stop trying to convince them. Instead, he focused on becoming unshakable. He let his actions speak. He became calm, intentional, unwavering, like a mountain standing firm against the winds of opposition. At first, his children barely noticed. But slowly, something changed. They saw a man who no longer needed validation, who didn't need to prove himself. They started listening, not because he demanded it, but because his presence commanded it. This is the lesson. When you stop fighting for respect, you become worthy of it. Buddhism teaches that the greatest strength is in stillness. The Dhammapada says, "The wise man does not chase the wind nor quarrel with fools. He walks his path, and in his silence, others hear him louder than words." Arguing is a sign that you are trying too hard. When you find yourself raising your voice, defending yourself over and over again, ask, "Who am I trying to convince, them, or myself?" Instead of arguing, embody wisdom. Instead of debating, be the example, like water shaping rock. Like the silent moon commanding the tides, true influence comes not from force, but from presence. 3. Withdraw your emotional dependence, find inner peace. Many parents unknowingly chain their happiness to their children's actions. If they call, you feel loved. If they don't, you feel forgotten. If they visit, your heart is full. If they are distant, loneliness creeps in like a silent thief. This emotional dependence becomes a quiet burden, one that suffocates both you and them. But here's the truth: no one can be the keeper of your happiness except you. Buddhism teaches us the principle of non-attachment, not as a form of indifference, but as the ultimate form of love. True love does not demand. It does not cling. It does not say, "If you love me, you must act this way." Instead, it gives freely, without expectation. The Buddha once told a parable about a man who was drowning in a river. Instead of swimming to the shore, he clung tightly to a floating log, fearing that without it, he would sink. He drifted endlessly, trapped by his own grasp. But the moment he let go, he realized, he could swim. Emotional dependence is that log. You believe it keeps you afloat, but in reality, it keeps you from moving forward. Helen, a retired schoolteacher, spent years waiting for her children's attention. She would sit by the phone, hoping for calls that never came. Each unanswered day chipped away at her self-worth. The love she had given so freely now felt unreturned. One evening, while scrolling through old family photos, she had a realization. She had given her whole life to her children, but had forgotten to give anything to herself. That night, she made a decision. She enrolled in a meditation retreat. She traveled to places she had always dreamed of seeing. She reconnected with old friends and started painting again, something she hadn't done in decades. She built a life of her own, and something incredible happened. Her children started calling, not out of obligation, but out of curiosity. They wanted to hear about her travels, her experiences, her new adventures. They were drawn to her, not because she needed them, but because she had become whole on her own. This is the paradox of emotional independence. The less you seek validation, the more freely it comes. The Dhammapada states, you yourself must strive. The Buddhas only point the way. Happiness is not something your children can give or take away. It is something you cultivate within yourself. Imagine standing in the middle of a storm. The winds howl, the rain pours, yet you remain unshaken, not because the storm has disappeared, but because you have found peace within it. That is the power of emotional independence. That is the secret to true love. 4. Set boundaries, and enforce them. Respect is not something freely given, it is cultivated through clear expectations. If you allow others, your children included, to overstep your boundaries, they will do so. Not out of malice, but because human nature thrives on precedent. History is filled with examples of leaders who commanded respect, not by force, but by the firmness of their boundaries. Consider Marcus Aurelius, the great Stoic emperor. He was known for his wisdom and restraint, yet he never allowed flattery or disrespect to sway his judgment. He listened, but he did not bend to manipulation. He ruled with both kindness and unshakable authority. And because of that, his people followed him with devotion. The same principle applies to parenting. George, a father of 3, spent years feeling invisible in his own home. His children interrupted him mid-sentence, dismissed his opinions, and treated his presence as an afterthought. He told himself, they are just kids. They'll learn. But they didn't, because he had never taught them. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, his son cut him off mid-story. This time, George put down his fork and calmly said, I will continue when you are ready to listen. Silence. His daughter, accustomed to brushing off his words, scoffed at his advice later that night. Instead of arguing, George simply said, you don't have to agree, but you will speak to me with respect. Then he walked away. At first, they tested him. They pushed. They waited for him to give in. But he didn't, and then, something changed. Over time, his children began to pause when he spoke. They started listening, not because he forced them to, but because he had set a standard, and he refused to lower it. Buddhist philosophy teaches, you are what you allow. When you let others cross your boundaries without consequence, you teach them that your limits are meaningless. But when you uphold them with quiet confidence, you train the world to treat you with the respect you deserve. Boundaries are not walls. They do not shut love out, they define the space where love can thrive without resentment. If you want respect, set your boundaries, and enforce them. 5. Stop giving without appreciation. Value yourself. In Zen, there's a saying, give freely, but do not give foolishly. True generosity is a gift of the heart, but when it is given without gratitude, it becomes a burden. Throughout history, we see that unchecked generosity often leads not to gratitude, but entitlement. Consider the tale of King Lear, the tragic Shakespearean monarch. He divided his kingdom among his daughters, expecting their love in return. But instead of appreciation, he received betrayal. Why? Because when love and generosity are handed out without discernment, they are mistaken for weakness. Many parents unknowingly fall into this trap. They pour endless time, money, and energy into their children, expecting appreciation but receiving indifference. Mark's story is no different. Mark was a father who had always been there for his children. He paid their bills when they overspent, fixed their problems when they stumbled, and dropped everything whenever they needed him. Yet, when he needed a favor, something as simple as help moving furniture, they were too busy. That was the moment it hit him. His giving had lost its value, so, he made a decision. The next time his son asked for money, he calmly said, "I love you, but you need to figure this out." When his daughter expected him to cancel his plans for her, he responded, "I have something important to do." At first, they were frustrated. They pushed back, confused by the change. But over time, something shifted. They stopped taking him for granted. They became more independent. And, perhaps most importantly, they started appreciating the times he did give, because it was no longer expected, but cherished. Buddhist wisdom teaches, a gift is only a gift when it is received with gratitude. Otherwise, it is an illusion. So ask yourself, are you giving because you truly want to? Or because you feel you must? True love is not about sacrificing yourself endlessly. It is about knowing your worth. Give when your heart feels full, but never at the cost of your own dignity. 6. Build a life outside of them, become whole again. There is a profound Zen truth, a tree that clings too tightly to its branches never allows them to grow. Many parents unknowingly fall into this trap. They make their children the center of their existence, pouring every ounce of their identity into their roles as caregivers. They measure their happiness by their children's attention, their self-worth by their children's success. But this kind of attachment does not foster closeness, it suffocates it. History offers us a striking example in Queen Victoria. After the death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, she withdrew from life, placing all her emotional energy into her children. Her suffocating grief and overbearing expectations pushed them away, straining their relationships. The lesson? When you lose yourself in others, they begin to run from you. Eleanor's story echoes this truth. Eleanor, a widow in her 60s, had devoted her life to her children. Every conversation revolved around their lives, their struggles, their choices. She offered advice they never asked for, worried endlessly when they didn't call, and waited anxiously for their visits. But instead of feeling loved, they felt burdened. They began to withdraw, answering calls less frequently, making excuses not to visit. Then, something changed. One day, Eleanor looked at herself in the mirror and asked, "Who am I beyond being their mother?" For the first time in decades, she decided to live for herself. She took up painting. She joined a meditation group. She started traveling, alone. Instead of waiting by the phone, she was too busy exploring the world, meeting new people, rediscovering old passions, and something miraculous happened. Her children started calling, not out of obligation, but out of curiosity. They wanted to hear about her adventures, to know the person she had become. She was no longer a shadow waiting in the background, she was a vibrant force, whole and complete. Buddhism teaches, when you let go, you make space for what truly matters. Your children do not need you to live for them. They need to see you living for yourself. When you become whole, you don't lose them, you inspire them to stay. Imagine waking up one day and realizing that you no longer crave validation. That your peace is unshaken, your presence commands respect, and your relationships are built on mutual understanding, not obligation. This is the power of embodying self-respect. Starting today, stop seeking approval. Instead, radiate dignity. Stop arguing. Instead, lead through wisdom. Withdraw emotional dependence and find strength within. Set boundaries, not to control others, but to honor yourself. Give only where appreciation exists. And most importantly, build a life that is rich, full, and independent of anyone else's validation. Now is the time to take action. Which lesson spoke to you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments, I'd love to hear your journey. And if you found value in these insights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join our growing Zen community. Together, let's cultivate wisdom, peace, and a life of true respect. Thank you for watching Zen Buddhism Wisdom. See you in the next video.